It's My Right Stuff with your host, Grammy Award-winning record producer and inventor, Toby Wright. My Right Stuff is brought to you by Tones, a natural sleep and sound healing portal available globally at www.tones.com. That's www.taumhoms.com. And I'm your announcer, Grinnin' Barrett. Here's Toby.
Hey, welcome back to My Right Stuff. I'm your host, Lord Toby Wright, and for what we hope will be a very informative and entertaining podcast. Today's guest on this podcast is a man you need to be very familiar with. His name is Mr. Rupert Isaacson. He is an author, a movie director, and a very loving dad to a special needs child. But first, I'd like to introduce my co-host of the evening, Mr. Gareth Dyton, aka DJ Chunky of Chunky's Choice Cuts.
Hey,
Hey
Toby.
Gareth, how you doing this evening?
Very, very, very well, my friend. How are you doing?
Oh, hanging in there, man. It's a great, beautiful day outside, and it's a great, beautiful day right here as well.
It's actually, the rain has stopped in Wales. We've had 3 continuous weeks of rain, and the sun is shining, so things are going pretty well here. But I think enough horsing around from us. Let's crack on and get tonight's podcast started.
I like it. I like it. Well, today's guest is Mr. Rupert Isaacson. He's a very fascinating man. And let's get to know Mr. Isaacson and his journey. Hey there, Rupert. How you doing today?
I'm good. I'm in Germany, which, rather like Wales, is actually in the middle of our 4th or 58th consecutive week of rain. But I'm very happy with it because we've had terrible droughts, and now suddenly I feel like we have the ecosystem back. So I'm all about the rain.
That's awesome. So I've been reading your books, and I've noticed that you seem to do a lot of work with horses and children. And you grew up around horses, or was this something that came in a little bit later?
It was both. My parents were not horsey, but I had a horsey aunt who lived in the Midlands outside of London. And I very much had the horse gene and the horse bug. Some people do. I had it.
Yeah.
And I had a market stall, actually, in a flea market in North London for a couple of years between the ages of 12 and 14. Made a bit of money to buy a racehorse off the track. Had a mentor, luckily, could keep it at my aunt's, would go up there at the weekends, and sort of ended up in horses.
Wow.
Excellent.
Well, obviously, having read your first book, I have to say that it's completely fascinating, and it's such an incredible voyage of sort of discovery. Are you happy to elaborate on actually some of those elements for us this evening?
Absolutely. I mean, just anything you want to know, just ask.
Cool. Thank you very much for that. The first question I want to ask you is that when your son met Betty, your neighbour's horse in the woods, do you believe they communicated in kind of like sort of other ways? Is this not untypical for autistic children or autistic people to develop their own ways of actually communication?
It's a good question. I mean, I don't know how much the people watching this podcast or listening to this podcast know about autism and my journey with my son. So I was actually trying to keep my son away from horses because I thought he wasn't safe around them. But he made his own connection with my neighbour's mare, and I happened to have the skills to go along with it because I'd been a professional with horses for many years, blah, blah, blah. But yes, what passed between him and the horse was unlike anything I'd seen before as a professional. And if you are in horses for decades, you absolutely know their body language, you know their signals, you know their speak. This was something different, and my son clearly had some sort of direct line to her, and she modified her behavior with him. This horse Betsy, although she's quite a quiet old mare, she's a bit of a bitch, and but not around him. Well, I mean, call a spade, but not around him. She would absolutely moderate and modify her behaviors and her reactions as if she was making a special set of rules for him.
Wow.
and this I recognise instantly. So the honest answer to your question is I don't know. And I'm very comfortable with I don't know as an answer, because I don't know usually leads you into interesting places. And that's indeed what I did, is I followed the I don't know and ended up somewhere quite interesting.
Yeah, superb. Thank you very much.
That's awesome.
That's very awesome.
So how did he start to speak? Was it like echolalia?
Yeah, well, what happened? Yeah, my son was at that time echolalic, and for people on this podcast who don't know what echolalia is when someone who is not verbal yet or fully verbal yet begins to echo, literally, things that they have heard. So it could be a advertising jingle, or a particular line from a movie that they like, or something usually repetitive. And this thing could mean anything from I'm happy, or I need the toilet, or I'm upset, or I'm just saying it because I'm exercising my vocal cords, and all points in between. And it could be, usually completely irrelevant. So it'd be like, it's an elephant, when they want to go to the toilet. That would have been one of my sons. When I first put Rowan, my son, onto Betsy's back, it wasn't riding. He was using her like a big old couch. And in this particular situation, all his agitated behaviors, or his stimming, as you call it, would just go away.
Wow.
Some days after that, I decided to ride with him. And it being Texas, Western saddle, big Western saddle, room for me and him together. So put him in front of me. And this was quite extraordinary. We were riding down, it was within the first 5 minutes, towards a pond. And he saw a big grey heron get up and fly away. He said, heron. I didn't know he knew that word. So even though he's echolalic, I mean, this was absolutely appropriate speech. He saw it, he named it, he identified it. And I was like, fuck, he's talking, Okay, what am I going to do with this? Okay, so I started giving him choices: left, right, faster, slower. And I noticed very quickly that the more I went at what we call the canter, what Western people would call the lope, the more speech I got, and I just followed it from there.
Did you document the journey as you went along, or was it retrospective?
It was a bit of both. So at first, the only documentation was, pictures that we took, or little videos that we took, and me writing notes. Because I'm not just a horse trainer, I'm a journalist and a writer. So it's natural for me to then, say, hey, look, this is something significant is going on here. I'm going to record it and, see, just if only for me. But then I had lived for some years before this with Bushman hunter-gatherer tribes in the Kalahari in Africa. And the reason is that my family's from down there, and I fell into journalism and human rights activism for dispossessed Bushman groups who'd been kicked off their land to make way for diamond mines, helping them get legal title to their ancestral land. And if you spend time with these people, they're hunting and gathering people. Everything happens within a shamanic context. There's nothing that's taken outside of the spiritual context, including their politics, including everything. And there's certainly their medicine. And whatever people think or don't, oh, that's all rubbish or whatever. What I can tell you is this: down in these areas which are very remote, people live a long way from Western medicine, and they will use Western medicine if they can find it. But most of the time they're a long way from it. So they will fall back on their traditional practices. And people get sick and get better a lot through this. So I had this in the back of my mind anyway when Ron was diagnosed. And then when there was this extraordinary connection with the horse, because from that first day with the speech, just more and more and more and more and more came. I thought, and we literally lived in the saddle together. I mean, we were there 3 to 5 hours a day in the saddle together. I thought, okay, is there a place that combines that kind of healing with horses? Because Africa, that's not horse country. Where has this type of healing and horses? And I thought, that's Mongolia. And this absolute gut feeling, got to go there. And then at that point, I thought, okay, yes, now we have to document it properly. Because when we go out to Mongolia, either something will happen or it won't. And if nothing happens, that's all right, actually, because at least autism didn't prevent us as a family from going and having this incredible adventure. In fact, the autism caused us to have this amazing adventure. And that alone is, a valid thing to record.
Sure.
But if something happens, I don't want to then say, write a book about it and say to people, oh, you've got to kind of believe that I went over here to this really far away place and met all these people that you'll never meet and did these things that you can't verify. And I came back with it. So I thought if we do this, we have to make a documentary if we can. And that's easier said than done, because I wasn't a documentary filmmaker. I had no idea how to do this. But I thought, it's important that we verify what does or does not happen. And so that's indeed what we did.
I suppose, as like sort of a journalist, if you set yourself up for something and it doesn't happen, then there's still value in that. There's actually still a story to report, isn't there?
100%. I mean, the story can go either way, and you can't be attached to the story being one way or the other. So I put out a book proposal at the time, because I was a writer, and I put it out through my agent in the way that you normally do to publishers, and said, I was just very honest in the proposal. I said, I'm not going to lie, I can't say that this will be successful, but it's a leap of faith. And generally in these situations, people's lives are shut down by special needs, and I want to document a life being opened up because of special needs. And the publishers kind of who took it kind of went, actually, either way, whatever happens or doesn't happen, we would like to see. And so they commissioned it.
And I suppose that's the difference between being a scientist and actually kind of a journalist. Like, if you approached it from a scientific method, then yes, you'd have your working hypothesis, you'd have your plan of action. Where if things don't go to plan, then that's the entire plan kind of down the Swanee, then, isn't it? Really.
That's right. I couldn't give a fuck about that. No, I mean, it was either it was an act of love, and just to think, well, look, even if my son never goes to the bathroom by himself and let alone lives independently, at least he and I will have had this incredible adventure together. And that's
absolutely
enough,
absolutely, that's incredible. It is absolutely incredible.
What was really weird was that before we even went out to Mongolia, the book was sold in about 30 languages. Like, before we went, and every publisher knowing that maybe fuck all would happen. And that to me was extraordinary. And that to me made me think, well, right, that there was some sort of shamanic irrational process at work.
Totally. And
so, because what happened with that was that at the time that I put the book proposal out, I was completely flat broke. My career was pretty much down the tubes. I was a journalist who made my living largely through travel to Africa, and also human rights activist. And so I had to completely stop doing this. I wasn't training horses anymore either. I basically ground to a halt and was just being a dad trying to figure it out. And so money was really tight. And as anyone knows who's a special needs parent or connected to a special needs family, listening to this podcast, it's really expensive. This whole process is really expensive. And at the time, you couldn't, this is back in 2004, you couldn't get insurances to pay for autism therapies. That's changed a bit now, but back then you certainly couldn't. So everything was out of pocket. And so what happened was, suddenly I just put this idea out. And I'm going anyway, regardless of if I get any money, I'll scrape it together and I'll go. And then suddenly there were all these publishers in all these countries saying, we're in. And money suddenly came. And I thought, okay, then we have to do two things with this money. One, we must make a documentary movie properly that shows if something does or doesn't happen, because that's an important record. Totally. Two, I need to start a center where kids that don't happen to have a neighbor with a quarter horse or whatever could get access to this kind of therapeutic riding. So even before I went out, I started a charitable foundation called the Horseboy Foundation, and I bought some land and built a centre, and began to develop that in anticipation that when I came back I would do this work, and I've been doing this work ever since. So when we were in Mongolia, what happened was we were out there for about a month, going across Mongolia on horseback, going from shaman to shaman, doing healing rituals. And we ended up in the far north, which is where Siberia comes down into Mongolia, and where the reindeer people live. And the reindeer people are one of the oldest cultures on the planet. And before the horse was ever domesticated, the reindeer was actually the first riding animal domesticated after the retreat of the ice sheets. And these people have a very strong shamanic tradition. It's very difficult to find them. It's very difficult to get into this area logistically. And we finally did, and we tracked down the shaman, which was by no means a guarantee that we could have. Lots of things had to come together that happened. And he conducted about 3 nights of rituals with us and with Rowan. And at the end, he said, he'll be fine. He said he'll get gradually less autistic, especially from the age of 9. And after that, Betsy will go and you will take over from Betsy, the horse, as his main protector. I was like, okay. And he said, but the stuff that really drives, and he said, you're also going to have to do 3 more journeys. You're going to have to, it doesn't matter if it's here. And he said, I know that you're connected to Africa, go down there, but do 3 more journeys after this will confirm the healing. But he said, the stuff that really drives you crazy, the incontinence, the tantruming, the being socially cut off, all that stuff, says that will stop kind of now. And I said, what do you mean now? Because I'd been around a lot of shamans in the Kalahari and other places before, and they don't normally give you such an unequivocal kind of, it will be green or it will be blue type thing. It's much more.
It's usually kind of open to sort of interpretation.
And so correct. And I was a bit surprised, and I was like, well, that's committing yourself a bit, isn't it? And he's like, no, you'll see. And we rode down the mountain. We were up at quite a high altitude. And about 27 hours after we left the reindeer camp, Rowan did his first intentional poo and cleaned himself. And we happened to catch it on camera. And for us, this was like watching England win the World Cup, which will never happen. Right? It's actually better, more personal. And from that day, absolutely, it panned out exactly as the healer Ghost was his name said it would. And I did do these 3 subsequent journeys in Africa, in Australia, and in the Navajo reservation, which I wrote a subsequent book about called The Long Ride Home.
Right.
And Rowan now today is 19. He has his own house, his own car. He's just been texting me today. He was just sitting a 6-hour exam preparatory to getting into college. He's thinking about where he wants to go to college. He's still very quirky. He's very autistic, but he's also super functional at the same time. He treads this line completely between these ways of being, which is awesome. Extraordinary and beautiful. And I'm just very honored to be his dad.
Absolutely.
That's an incredible tale. Really is incredible. One question I do have to ask, though, is do you have a copy of the books in each language they've been published in? I just imagine you've actually got a cupboard somewhere that's just full of the same book but in loads of different languages.
I've got a bookshelf that has things in Cyrillic script and languages I can't decipher.
Fabulous.
With pictures of my son on it. Yeah,
that's incredible.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, we know the book has been turned into a documentary. Are there ways to actually develop it any further, to do anything else with it? Because
there is a fictional movie in development, but it's been in development for quite a long time, for years actually. And as these things often are, we'll see if it ever sees the light of day. It probably will. In my experience, these things often take a decade. the book was published and the documentary was released in 2009. It went to TV in many countries. It also went to cinema in some countries and things. And very quickly from the get-go, there was a lot of film interest. But for bazillions of reasons, it hasn't yet gotten made, but it might next year. We will see.
Well, it is indeed a phenomenal story, and it's just one that
Absolutely.
lends itself to film, in so many ways.
Yeah. There are times when it's hard to believe that we did it. And I come from a family of adventurers. I mean, we're South Africans, Zimbabweans, adventures in the blood, really. Colonials, you go down to these places and do stuff. But even by my standards and my family standards, this was a stretch. But the subsequent journeys were too. But what happened was, though, when the book came out and the film came out, one of the standard challenging questions I would get was, well, are you saying that shamanism cures autism, or are you saying that horses cure autism, or are you saying that you've got to go to Mongolia? And I was like, no, of course not. Every family has their own personal journey, and for some people it might be horses, for another person it might be balloons and bicycles. But what you have to do is you've got to follow the child.
Right.
That's for sure. And where that journey takes you could surprise you, but that journey might take you no further than your own neighborhood, and it will be no less valid and real. What matters is it producing the healing that you're looking for, that you're looking for. And there's every special needs parent, I mean, God, let's face it, most parents are basically sort of going to Mongolia every day in their living room anyway, And I remember at the time, my ex, Rowan's mum, was very resistant to going, and she said, look, Roo, just going to the supermarket is so stressful. Why would we, we're going to keep this incontinent, screaming, half-aware kid safe on a horse across Mongolia? Are you nuts? And I said, yeah, but precisely because going to the supermarket is so stressful, frankly, we might as well go to Mongolia, because we're effectively going to Mongolia every day, So I mean, at least that one is cooler than that one, so let's do it. It's more interesting.
I know it's incredible to know the ways that you've developed helping children and parents in their similar situations to yourselves. There's no doubt that the horseboy method and the movement method have a great deal of success, and I'm guessing that must be an awesome feeling. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, remember I said that when these book deals came in, even before we had gone to Mongolia, with these publishing companies being in complete knowledge that we might not kind of get a result, and being down for the adventure anyway, I realized, I was like, okay, I've got to harness this to help kids have the same experience that Rowan had. And so I started this little center in rural Texas, close to where I live, I called it New Trails, because everyone thought the New Trails Ranch, it was this inspirational name, but actually it was just on a road called New Trails Road. So it was much more prosaic. We could have called it Bell End Lane, or whatever. So just happens to not be called that.
Just as well, really.
The act of God. Yeah. So what happened was, I just started working in the same way that I had been working with Rowan, and this was following the advice of a very well-known autistic person in the US called Dr. Temple Grandin, who is an adult autist, but who's also a best-selling author, neuroscientist, professor of animal behavior, Colorado State University, etc. And I'd gone to her for mentorship in the early days with Rowan and said, what do I do? How does my son become you? And she said, do these 3 things: follow the child, intellectually, emotionally, physically. Do your stuff outside in nature because there's fewer bad sensory triggers there, and let him move and move. I mean, do not confine him to a desk. Do not confine him to a room, because most of these kids are kinesthetic learners. And I said, that I think I can do. And so I continued to do this, and I realized very quickly that whether I was with a horse or not, I was getting results this way. But I always got my best results on the horse in certain rhythms. And I started to document what these rhythms were, and then figure out ways to emulate them using play equipment and other things. And then this became really successful. So I started adapting, all my team by this point started adapting the national curriculum so that we could homeschool this way. And that became successful, even with kids that seemed to have all sorts of learning difficulties. We could suddenly teach math and science and everything, it moving like this. And so I then went to neuroscientists and said, I went to neuroscientists in the USA, University of California, at the Sorbonne, in Paris, and in Germany too. And I asked them all, why is it working? And they all gave me the same answer. And it was quite a simple answer, actually. And I thought, okay, this means we could replicate it. Good. So we began to put together two methods, one with horses, one without. Horseboy method with horses, movement method without horses. And relatively quickly, movement methods began to catch on in schools. Usually in schools that were either failing and looking for innovative things, kinetic learning, kinesthetic learning, learning through movement, or in special needs schools. And now I would say we have about 100 locations around the world. We probably, people that we have trained, probably serve about 200,000 families a week. It's sometimes I'm a bit stunned by it. Because the method is actually really easy. It's super easy. Once you understand the basic brain science of what's going on, it's easy to emulate, and anyone basically could do it.
Right. That's awesome.
That's incredible. That is truly incredible.
So what's next for Horseboy?
Well, one of the things about the autistic brain is that it's because it's dominated by the amygdala, which is your fear center of the brain. That's what makes everything so difficult. Producing too much of this stress hormone, cortisol. And you have to then counteract this stress hormone with the antidote hormone, which is oxytocin, which you get through hip rocking in rhythm, which of course you get on the back of a horse, right?
Okay.
But you can also get it in other ways. Oxytocin calms the nervous system, tells the amygdala, shut up already. There isn't an elephant coming through the wall right now. You can relax. And stop producing all that cortisol, open up the brain for learning. But oxytocin also happens to be the communication hormone. So suddenly you've got this child who's locked in, doesn't want to communicate anyway. That's autism, autoism, auto Greek for the self. So selfism, locked within the self, who's then governed by fear and shut down by the stress hormone. And this oxytocin comes in and sort of opens that all up and makes them communicate. And then these other things happen in the brain. When you move and problem solve, your brain produces a protein, and this protein is called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Brain-derived, produced by the brain, brain cell, trophic, growing of factor. So the brain producing more of its own brain cells. And among the optimizing brain function, and among these brain cells that are being produced, is a series of really interesting cells in the cerebellum called Purkinje cells. And they're named, they should be pronounced Purkinje, because they're named after a Czech scientist from the 19th century, actually, who discovered them. And they're the largest neurons you've got. And they act like a communications network in the brain and get all the different parts of the brain to communicate properly with each other. And they govern both motor skills and social skills.
Oh, wow.
And both things which are, a big challenge for people on the spectrum. And one of the things about people on the spectrum is that they're very honest usually. So they won't lie and pretend something that works just to please you. So if something works for someone on the spectrum, it's probably going to work across the board. So it's like a bottom line. So we now work with a bunch of other populations, particularly with trauma, which produces effects very similar to autism because it's cortisol based, it's fear center based.
Yeah.
And so what's next for us now is we work with the US Air Force Academy. We have a veterans program there, but we also have we started to work with the Bundeswehr, the German army, producing veterans post-traumatic stress disorder programs in nature to kind of basically relearn. And then the nature aspect is so important. And I've been looking at this in some detail because if you're going to do what we do to be effective, you have to do it in the right environment. And of course, the school is not nature. So I started thinking, well, okay, how do we bring nature into the environment? So we started doing makeovers of classrooms really simply and easily using natural materials and documenting it and getting data on it. And the data shows that if the kid, these are usually quite tough schools, it's only going to be the tough schools that would invite hippies like us to come in.
Right.
Because they've tried everything else and nothing else has worked. So it's like, all right, we might as well try this movement.
I also think sometimes I think sometimes for example, you made the comment earlier about failing schools actually like sort of inviting you in. And sadly, you actually kind of think, well, schools who've already been down the actual like sort of more traditional methods and have now got nothing left to lose, they basically are the people who are going to be far more open to actually kind of new things.
Of course. I mean, people need a reason,
Absolutely.
So because we found that putting natural materials, wood, stone, bone, sand, wood chips, river stones, any driftwood, anything you can, and plants, in fact, trees in classrooms. And then we started designing science programs around these trees. And then we started designing economic projects around these trees, where you could sell the trees, or you could sell part of the tree, or you could harvest products from the tree and sell those. And then you could do carbon credits to local businesses for a tenner, and that sort of thing. And from there, we thought, well, fuck, what if we started putting actual forests into schools?
Yeah.
What about that? So I thought, well, people have this idea of the forest schools. But the forest schools, they're not really forest schools. I mean, they're not in the forest usually. You sort of go to the forest. They've got aspects of forest.
Yeah.
But most kids will never get into the forest. And if we're hoping that the planet will be saved, and we're working with all these kids and autistic kids, it'd be kind of nice if there's a planet for them to live on.
Totally.
Otherwise, it's all a bit of a moot point. So we've worked with a couple of schools, putting forests into the school grounds, because there's always a lot of room in school grounds, like around the car parks and things like that. Land that you wouldn't think, narrow strips where it's just grass that they cut. You can make whole screens of trees there. So we did that, and then we thought, what about putting them in the classroom? Okay, we could do that. And I thought, well, sod it. Maybe we should go a bit further afield. So recently we approached a town in Germany, which happens to be close to one of our Horseboy movement method places, and said, what about a community forest?
Yeah.
And I thought we were going to have all kinds of pushback. And they went, yeah, all right. I mean, like, what do you mean, yeah, all right? And they said, yeah, great. We'll do a tree for every member of the county, basically. Yeah. That's 285,000 trees.
Wow.
I'm like, okay.
Sure.
And now I can suddenly see that we're able to expand this. So what sort of started with my son in a field, and then went out to a sort of therapeutic riding technique, and then went out to a homeschooling technique, and then went out to a school technique, and then went out to a rewilding, if you like, technique, and then trauma and and now these community forests. It's very interesting to me how this thing has had its own energy, and I just sort of keep following it, really.
That's incredible.
You really don't have a choice at this point, right? It's like me and my sound healing. It just keeps evolving, and I just want to help more and more people as it keeps growing, right? And that's one of the things.
So now I'm going to put my journalist hat on. Tell us a bit about your sound healing, Toby.
So my sound healing was born of me getting into a car accident and having nerve damage to the entire right side of my body, where I was just very numb. And so,
Mm.
I went to all the proper doctors, Western medicine people, Eastern medicine, massage, the whole nine yards, and nothing was helping. And so I took to the internet,
Okay.
because it was, 2005 or six, about that time. And I took to the internet and I found this thing called sound healing. Had no idea what it was. Was living in a very artist community called Topanga, California at the time. And, I
Mm.
just started researching it. I had a studio out in Woodland Hills, and I started researching it, and I literally read thousands of, hundreds of websites and thousands of pages,
Yeah.
on this particular thing called sound healing. So I made lists, and this frequency can help you do this, and this one can help you do that, and all that kind of good stuff. And I put all my research together, and I went in the studio and I made what I call now a tonality, which are a bunch of, up to about 34 to 36 different sine wave frequencies of different frequencies, obviously. And I mixed them together. And at first, when I listened, I was like, oh, that sounds horrible. What the hell is that? And then I thought to myself, why don't I mix it? Right. And I knew a lot about electronics. I knew about, formulas of electronics and how the curves go and all that kind of stuff, Ohm's law and the whole
Yeah.
nine yards. So I made up a little formula, and I said, okay, this frequency is going to, this lower frequency is going to be at 0 here. The next one will be at -3, the next one at -6, so on and so forth. And I just kind of created a linear type of environment for these things to breathe, right? And I called it the power curve. And so when I was done,
Yeah.
I had this really cool little thing, this tonality that kind of beats by itself, right? And I found myself, like going home and putting it in my CD player. I play it overnight and I would fall asleep. And I thought, wow, that's pretty wild. Somebody came to me, a friend of mine, said, hey, um, I'm having trouble sleeping. I go, hey, try this little CD. Here's a DVD, whatever it was. Because they were like, for an hour was like 4.3 gigs or something, right? So it was very, I kept it in the wave format, because MP3 I found just cut off the bottom and the top frequencies, and it didn't do its job properly.
Okay.
And so, moving into it, I thought, wow, that's pretty wild that, this thing needs all of this, and I didn't realize it at the time. And so I kept doing research and kept doing research. And what I came up with was what now exists on the internet at tomes.com, and which is, 3 levels of sleep, that you can get into if you play it, while you sleep. There's also 16 sound healing titles, dealing with everything, from tinnitus and pain management and, things like that. And I'd like to, get into, especially, I'd like to try some stuff with you and the horses and stuff, because,
Mm.
this does really work on anything with a heartbeat on the planet. And, our buddy
Absolutely.
Ryan has tried it in his barn and seen some results with his horses. Kristen and Jason, who are students of yours as well, have also tried it and seen a bit of
Yeah.
results. And then then 2020 came along, and we know what happened there. So we've been kind of at a halt, with some experiments and things to just document what it can do. And then I have the ability to tweak it on a moment's notice. So when I go into a sleep lab, I can actually mix your sleep, if you will, um, and bring
Huh.
in bring it into a place where you're hearing 2 and 3 and 5 hertz, and your brain will just naturally, as slow down and relax, and you'll be out like a light.
Hmm.
So that's pretty much how that works. And it
Fascinating.
can. I am very, very convinced that it's in all the research I've done, I'm convinced
Mhm.
that this can help with autism. This can help with cancer. This can help with all kinds of
Sure.
Yeah.
crazy things that people take pills and
It's
medicine
going to
for.
help with anything that's brain and nervous system. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Totally.
Absolutely. I'd love to give it a go. I'd love to give it a go. Yeah, let's do it. Let's make a bit of an experiment. We'll get together and figure out what the best way for
That
that is.
sounds great. I would love to, because it's it's right there in my heart as your studies are in yours.
Mm,
And it just means the
mm.
world to me. And I know that yours does as well, with your son. So it's crazy. I mean, I don't know. I could just go on and on and on.
What I'm wondering is if you had these tonalities on in sort of toxic human environments, let's say that you had, you know, a school where bullying is rife, or your average riding stable where you have a bunch of snobby people being
Right.
poopy butts, or this sort of thing, and you just have this stuff on in the background. Because I do remember, Gareth, you might remember this. There was, I think it's about 10 years ago, probably longer now because I'm so old. I seem to remember there was reading this article on a shopping centre in Essex,
The mosquito.
which had this real problem with vandalism.
Yeah, the mosquito tonality they were playing. So it was something that was adopted by quite a lot of centres in actually the UK, wasn't it? It was basically it was a sound wave frequency that could only be heard by sort of under 17-year-olds. So effectively, it was like kind of broadcast or pumped out in areas where perceived troubled kids would kind of hang around kind of after dark. I believe that it was termed the mosquito, I believe.
Okay, and what did they see good effects?
I'm not entirely sure. I think I'm pretty sure the actual effects on it were varied, because obviously, as you actually both know, human beings actually develop at actually kind of different stages and actually at different times. So where one 17-year-old
Right.
may well be from a developmental perspective, that's not where all 17-year-olds are going to be, etc. So it was kind of varied.
Right.
Right. I also remember there was someone a shopkeeper who was so frustrated by kids hanging out and basically driving people away from his business. He started playing Baroque classical music through his loudspeakers, and it just made all these kids go away.
Of course it did. You wouldn't play Motley Crue. Yeah. Right. So I did a little experiment, and I have a tonality called Tiamo, which means love. Which means love in Italian, obviously. And this particular tonality was born in the pandemic because the what's it called, the domestic violence rate had risen about 125% at this point.
Yep.
And I thought, man, that's really that's disgusting. Actually, how can I help? And so I did a lot of research into human emotion and what it means to the body and to your brain to be next to somebody that you don't really like that much and having to spend time in lockdown and so on and so forth. So I came up with this tonality which has elements of love and compassion and enlightenment, and and the instructions on the website are that you will play this in the background throughout the day, right?
Okay.
And it's just an hour long. And so you would, just leave it on repeat or whatever, just, keep playing it. And I think that, the number of people that I know that have tried it, it definitely helped their living situation, and they were a lot more calm around each other.
Okay.
So, there are those, there are those things out there that, as silly as it may sound, but they really do help.
Well, they do. And actually, it doesn't sound silly at all. I mean, going back to shamanism,
Right.
so, I talked about being in the Kalahari with shamans and in Mongolia with traditional healers and so on. All of these things happen around tonalities, actually. Rhythm, particularly. And the earliest forms, the purest forms of it, which are the hunting and gathering tribes, often they don't use drums. Often they use it's hand clapping and polyphonic chant. And it sounds, when you first hear it, quite simple until you try to reproduce it, and then you realize how extraordinarily complex it is, and how it goes straight to your nervous system, really your vagal nerve.
That's right.
Which is the nerve that would transmit, say, oxytocin from your gut to your brain, and touches all your organs along the way. It's the biggest nerve in your body. And if you've got good vagal tone, as they call it, you're probably doing all right physically your immune system is good, you have good empathy, etc. And if you've got bad vagal tone, and people that grew up, say, in very violent households, criminal neighborhoods, refugee camps, war zones, often have bad vagal tone and have trouble with emotional connection and so on, and seeing consequences to things, projecting perspective onto situations. If I do this, then maybe this will happen. Not behaving so impulsively, etc. Which of course is very tied up with trauma, very tied up with hyper awareness, very tied up with PTSD. All these things. They're all sort of versions of the same thing. And healing at its basic form is always about sound.
That's right.
And then you go into Mongolia, where they will use the sort of Siberian shaman drums, which are these round drums which you see sort of from Lapland right across to, say, Kamchatka, right across and then through Native America as well. So it's one boreal kingdom sort of forest zone thing. And then you get into other areas where they'll use other drums and other sounds and so on. But it's always around this song, and then dance as well, that you move to these rhythms.
The rhythm.
And you take the rhythm up through your own body. And the shaman in particular does this. The people who are present at the shaman fire might or might not do this, but the shamans absolutely do. And they dance themselves into trance. They dance themselves into an altered state of consciousness. And most shamanic practices do not involve hallucinogenic or other psychoactive plants. There are some areas of the world where they do, famously, of course, the Amazon with ayahuasca and things like that. But in general, not. In general, it's done through movement and dance and form and sound. So I think what you're getting to, Toby, is really sort of the roots of what human healing is and what medicine is.
Yeah,
I agree. And
sound, music, story.
Exactly. And I've been in music all my life, so I know the feeling of a good of music, right?
Yeah.
And I think that post that accident, and it's been almost 12 years or so. The only thing that I can see with my physical body, and I have all my touch back, everything is wonderful as far as that goes, but my right eye is just a little bit droopy sometimes, and that's due to the nerve damage again. And so, if that's the only thing wrong with me and everything else is perfect, I feel like I hit a home run or three.
Yeah.
And so it's been quite a very wonderful journey. And I'd love for you to try it. I'd love for you to try it with your son.
Yeah, let's
animals.
give it a go.
And we'll hook up after this podcast. I'll give you all the information, and
awesome.
We can go from there. But
Sounds
I know
good.
that I know that Gareth has a bunch of questions more, because I can see him chomping at the bit over there.
Obviously, you've touched about the kind of the shamanism and kind of issues and the kind of things like that. And I just wanted to say that if you consider the lots of basically what we consider to be Western medicine actually stems from plant healing and kind of original recipes along kind of those lines. Like, for example, there's a medication that's used to treat cardiac problems called sort of digitalis, which is foxglove, which is actually a poison, and kind of things like that. Actually kind of aspirin, the fundamental is willow. Yeah, exactly
It's
that.
willow.
So there are, I think, within like sort of Western medicine, there will always be a nod and a wink back actually to those kind of times, because there has to be, doesn't there, really?
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, also not just in drugs. So it's very interesting. My uncle was the head of pathology at University College Hospital in London, and he's a pretty eminent pathologist, Dr. Peter Isaacson. You can Google him. Not always a terribly nice bloke, and certainly a bloke that if he thought that you were full of shit, would be very happy to take a shit all over you, and frequently did. And so when we made the Horseboy film, I had a screening, private screening for the family in London, even though I was living in America at the time. he was there, and he at the end, I thought, oh, he's going to take a big old shit. So I went up to him and I opened this imaginary umbrella and I put it over my head and I said, all right, take a shit, surf's up, do your worst, let's have it. And he said, actually, Rupert, this particular time, I'm not going to take a shit. And I said, oh, that's interesting. That's very unlike you. Why? What else? What worst thing in your arsenal have you got? And he said, well, actually, no. He said, I'll tell you why I'm not going to take a shit today. He said, because two things. He said, one, remember this is back 2009. He said, you're saying that autism actually might not be a terrible thing, might be a rather beautiful thing, might be a very useful thing. This is interesting. And so that, he said, the real reason I'm not taking shit is because you've touched on something which we as pathologists know quite well, which is that Western medicine isn't just founded on plants, it's founded on irrational shamanic healing. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, it's the placebo effect. And I said, go on. He said, well, when you get a drug from your doctor, you get a prescription, that drug, and you go to the chemist and they fill it out, that drug has gone through a drug trial. And that drug trial had to have a control group that didn't get the drug, that got a placebo. And the drug had to make more people better than the placebo did, which means that every drug trial, there's a significant proportion of people, sometimes more than the drug, who get better on the placebo. And they don't just think they get better and die later. They actually get better. And no one really knows quite why. And he said, so people misunderstand the placebo effect. He said, people will dismiss it and say, oh, that's just the placebo effect. He said, it means, Rupert, they fundamentally misunderstand that the placebo effect is one of possibly the most powerful force for healing, so that a drug has to at least be on a par with that before it can be considered, for sales. They said, is it possible that, these ancient spiritual and medicinal technologies outside of the herbologies and the plants, can somehow trigger the immune system and other healing functions within the body? He said, quite probably, because otherwise we wouldn't have the placebo effect, and otherwise, frankly, all these people would be dead because they get sick and they have to use these things. And if there was nothing in it, they die, So he said that's interesting. So for this particular day in your life, Rupert, I'm not going to take a shit, but next time I probably will.
I worked for a research project. As part of my clinical work, I worked for a research project for a year. And we were basically, we split people into two categories. Obviously, there was a portion who had a degree of treatment and a portion who didn't. But out of the portion who didn't, they had increased clinical time, and a number of people actually were symptomatically improved from increased clinical attention. Then, if you know what I mean.
Okay. Right. Bedside manner, basically.
So,
effectively, and it was probably a mix between empathy, interest, and spending time with people. And there actually was a marked sort of clinical improvement in actually kind of a handful of those non therapeutic patients.
Absolutely. When I've talked to a shaman, a good shaman, I don't mean a man who lives in Hampstead and has gone on a course in shamanism and says, I'm a shaman.
Right.
I mean someone who's actually, gone through that, coming out of that culture and lives in those areas and is busy working at this thing, who are good at what they do. They're usually people who are sort of in their 60s and up, senior people who've been at it for a while. And when you say to them, well, what is it then, actually, this healing power that you use? Because they often give it a name. The Bushmen call it Num, which means, it's one of these untranslatable words. It can mean strength, power, healing, wisdom. It can, some people even use it to mean marijuana. It's a word that they use. Obviously, we know chi from a lot of the Asian on ki, etc. Right. Anyway, so when I've tried to nail people down and say, well, what is Num then? What is ki? What is chi? They'll say, oh, Rupert, it's actually quite simple. It's just love. It's
Yeah.
just that with a certain training process of several decades, you can learn to harness this.
Agreed.
And that's what it is. And
Yeah,
so I
totally.
absolutely agree with you, Gareth. You know, if you put people in a human environment where they're feeling nurtured,
Yeah.
for sure, a large proportion are going to get better.
Right.
Oh, totally. Totally.
Yeah.
I just want to go back to something we spoke about earlier
Mm.
on briefly. Earlier on, we actually touched on the actual kind of Indigenous Land Rights Fund, which is a project you've been involved with for a long time. Can you basically
Mm.
tell us, like, sort of a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that was sort of my previous to autism life. So I don't know if you remember earlier, I said I was involved as a human rights activist mostly in Botswana, actually, and
Yes.
a bit
Yeah.
in South Africa,
Right.
helping hunting and gathering tribes to get legal title to their ancestral land, usually after they'd already been evicted,
Yeah.
usually illegally.
Mhm.
And to my great surprise, we were very successful,
Yeah.
because it all started with me. It was a personal family story. My family's colonial white African.
Mhm.
On my mum's side, English and Afrikaner, which are effectively enemies of each other. And on my dad's side, Jewish. And on my mum's side, on the Afrikaner side, interestingly, not all white. And my non-white family, I found out, were
Mhm.
related by marriage, but by community very strongly, to the last group of Bushmen living in South Africa at the time. We'd been kicked out of what's now a big national park in the north. And they were asking,
Mhm.
once Mandela had come in, they were asking for their land back.
Yeah.
And I thought, I have to go follow this story. And I found I was indeed related to this group. And
Mhm.
when they found out that I was related to them, they made me do all kinds of things. They made me bring my mother out from London. They said it
Yeah.
was your mother's stories that brought you out here. And they stripped my mother naked on the dunes and poured plant pollen all over her, and then made us go up to find this other healer in Botswana
Yeah.
who did this healing ritual and said, okay, a year from today, you are going to sit down with Thabo Mbeki, the president of South Africa, and sign the land claim for your ancestral lands. And I thought,
Mhm.
no, we won't.
Yeah.
And we were also working with lawyers and other things that said, well, fuck me,
Yeah.
a year and a day
Wow.
to that day, we sat down with Thabo Mbeki in the sand dunes and signed the largest land claim in South African history.
Wow.
And
Fuck.
because of that, I know a group in Botswana who have been kicked off their land by diamond mines, De Beers Diamonds,
Right.
because the country
Yeah.
of Botswana is basically a company town, for De Beers Diamonds.
Yeah. Yeah.
Said, okay, would you help us? We're like, all right. And I had no idea what to do. And I went to speak to a group at the United Nations,
Yeah.
who's purported to do this sort of stuff. And they looked at me and said, you stupid hippie, fuck off. And I thought, oh, well, that's not very nice.
Yeah.
What am I
Okay.
going to do? And I managed to scrape together funds to hire human rights lawyers, and we went at it for about 7 or 8 years
Mhm.
against unlimited money, from not just from De Beers, but from the fact that Botswana's own high court system, well, they're all
Yeah.
cousins. They're all the same nobility,
Yeah.
aristocratic Botswana tribal families. That, what were the odds that we would get anywhere with this? Because the Bushmen
Yeah.
are considered to be basically subhuman. There's
Yeah.
racism, a lot of racism within Africa. And but we won. And I remember
Excellent.
being asleep on the sofa in Texas, and I got a call from the BBC saying, "Oh, can we have a comment, please?" And I said, "A comment for what?" And they went, "Well, you won." I went, "What do you mean we won? Who's we?" And they said, "The land claim, your organisation, the Indigenous Land Rights Fund." We were also working with a group called Survival International in the UK, who were very good,
Yeah. Mhm.
etc. And some other groups. It wasn't just us. And
Yeah.
I said, okay, yeah, I've got a quote for you. The quote is "fuck me sideways," because I honestly did not expect to win at all.
No.
It's like,
Yeah.
this is extraordinary. So you can quote me on that,
Yeah.
And this was happening right at the time that Rome was diagnosed. My
Right.
son was diagnosed, and what I think was useful for me was that I had this exposure to this kind of shamanic healing within the cultures that I was working with in Africa.
Right.
Yeah.
And I saw it just working so many times. And then I also, I guess, got schooled in activism, that I realized that it really doesn't matter if the odds are poor. What matters is that you have a go.
Right.
Yeah.
Just have a go.
Yeah.
And take a bit of a sporting attitude to it. Don't be too attached to outcome. I remember there was a woman, Pauline Tanjore, who was a Maori activist who we worked with a bit. We worked a lot at the State Department, and we did in the UN, and we did all that stuff as well as being right there in the field with shamans. And she said to me, "Oh, Rupert, you got this big ego, and you're so attached to winning, and if you don't win, you're going to be just crushed." I was like, "No, Pauline, you don't understand me at all. I've got no ego attached to this at all.
Yeah.
I'm just in it for a laugh, really. I mean, I'm in it. I'm more than that. I mean, I'll give it my best, but I'm in it for the adventure. And if it works out with a sort of result with a capital R, well, fantastic.
Yeah.
And if not, well, it was the adventure that came up in front of me to do.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to chicken out of it.
Yeah.
So let's have a go." And so I very much felt the same when it was Rowan's autism and his inability to speak and inability to communicate and that sort of thing, and the terrible tantrums. I just thought, well, let's have a go.
Yeah.
And so when we went out to Mongolia and all of that, I wasn't so attached to the outcome, but I was attached to the idea that life should be an adventure.
Right.
Absolutely.
If that makes sense.
And I think as well that that when you're up against things like that, you have to have a degree of sort of belief, because if you didn't have self-belief, then you wouldn't be in that situation in the first place.
Right.
And I think probably the driving force for about 65% of that motion has to be that self-belief, that self-drive, that kind of almost like a I want to say a self-fulfilling prophecy, but I'm not sure that's the right terminology. Do you kind of understand where I'm coming from?
You have to be optimistic.
Yeah.
You definitely have to be optimistic. And, South Africans are quite optimistic people. It's interesting. There's a saying that goes through Afrikaner culture, but it's really all through South African culture, no matter what color you are or whatever. It's in Afrikaans, it's "own sala plan maak."
Okay.
We'll make a plan.
Yeah.
So you'll hear this time again, sort of say, "Well, how are you going to do that?" I say, "Oh, sala plan maak." We'll make a plan, which means I don't know how in this 5 minutes.
Right.
No, I can't tell you how I'm going to do it, but I do have faith that if we engage in the process, we'll probably figure it out.
I like that optimism.
Right.
If not, we'll have fun.
Absolutely.
I've made records like that.
Yeah,
obviously, you spent a lot of time with
I've actually done
ancient
loads of shows
tribes
like
and
that.
peoples, and as part of Rowan's healing process, and they clearly have a lot of knowledge. Do you think there's lessons that we could all learn from them as humans?
Yeah, I mean, from autistic people.
No, from the ancient tribes and the peoples that you spent time with in South Africa.
Oh yeah, well, look, absolutely. Well, one of the things, but it actually amounts to the same thing.
Yeah, and any of the
because hunting and gathering people do not make war. They do not organize for conflict. It's not that conflict doesn't arise between individuals. It does.
Sure.
Fists get thrown. I mean, they're people. But what they don't do is say, "Oh, look, we're having a bit of a drought here. Over in Gareth's village, it's raining. Let's go over to Gareth's village and fuck everybody up, nick their shit, and take it back to us." They don't do that.
Yeah.
And the reason why they don't do that, and these are the oldest cultures on the planet, these are the original cultures. They're, if you like, the most successful cultures because they've been around the longest. And they will be around after ours collapses because they're not dependent upon the same artificial support structures that we are.
Right.
They don't need supply chains, for example. Right. If the Maersk shipping containers do not arrive from China,
right,
they're okay.
Yeah.
And so If the Suez Canal gets
I
blocked,
see.
it doesn't matter much to them. They're so adept at living from their environment that they have a lot of time for quality of life, leisure, that sort of thing, but culture. But at the same time, also they don't overpopulate quite consciously. When you hunt and you gather, you live in the optimum clan size is about 24
Wow.
people. I'm talking about one local extended, clan. You could have a lot of these groups of 24 dotted through the countryside.
Yeah.
But you don't. So typically, what happens is women take control of their own. They have control of their own uterus because they have 50% of the say in economic activity. Because in the growing season, they are the dominant force economically, and in the non-growing season, men with hunting are the dominant force. So it evens out.
Interesting.
And so they don't want to have usually more than 2 kids, and the reason is you don't want to overpopulate when you're hunting, because
Right.
you don't want to exhaust the resources, and you don't need to, because when you practice agriculture, which came in later, herding, you actually need quite a lot of manpower for this. It takes a lot to put a crop in the ground
Right.
and pull the crop out of the ground. And you also exhaust the soil when you do this, and then you kill off all the game and the livestock, and the wildlife, etc. So you don't have other resources to fall back on if your crop fails. And then if your crop is good, you have a surplus, and then you think about what to do with that. So you've got to protect that surplus. But what if you don't have that surplus, and you've got all these excess people? But in Gareth's village, they do have a surplus. I've got all these people. Gareth has a surplus. I'm going to take these people and make them warriors and go over to Gareth's village, nick his granaries and also his women and his children and enslave them. So I have more manpower. And that whole cycle of apocalypse and warfare begins. And so what do we learn from these hunting and gathering tribes in particular is don't be a fucking asshole.
I love that.
If you're going to go around being a fucking asshole, you're basically going against what it is to be a human being. And it's very nice to know that the original blueprint for humanity is not the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and rape and murder and war and famine and pandemics and things, because all these things happen when people get overpopulated and cluster together. All this happened with agriculture. So when you go and spend time in hunting and gathering cultures, you end up seeing human beings at their most functional, and it gives you a lot of faith in our species. Okay, we're crazy motherfuckers who are half chimpanzee who want to kill everyone and tear everyone apart, and we're half bonobo who just want to fuck all day and like have fun and smoke dope and and have a beer. And we're like half bonobo, half, which is the lowland mountain gorilla that solves all the problems through sex, if people don't know that, and half straight up chimpanzee who are kind of crazy if they fight territorial wars and are horrible to each other. And we are schizophrenic. We are half and half. And we're very close in DNA. So it seems that through this shamanic process, the ancient cultures, these original cultures, let's say, learn to manage their chimpanzee-ness, harness it creatively, celebrate as an ethic the bonobo-ness, and kind of find a way that's lasted us for a few million years. And only the last 10,000 years since the advent of agriculture, and with it warfare, violence against women and children, in slavery, blah blah blah. Only since then have we kind of gone off the rails a bit. And so, are we in our terrible twos, or are we teenagers, or something like that? It seems so, but that's why we have a justice system. That's why we know that things like murder and rape are wrong. That's why we have politicians, no matter how corrupt they are, feel they have to justify wars to their populace if they didn't.
Yeah.
If it was really part of human nature, we just like, hey, it's a war, it's fun, let's go do it, let's go fuck them up. Yeah, let's go do it. And people think, oh, that's how the Vikings did it, but the Vikings didn't really do it for that reason. The Vikings did it because they ran out of resources where they were, because they overpopulated.
Yeah.
And like, shit, we're starving here, we better go figure it out.
Right.
So what we can learn, I think, is that in our purest form, in our original form, which we all do carry around inside us, we're actually pretty cool. We're actually love. We're actually God. We're actually nice.
Exactly.
We're actually okay. And this is good to know.
I agree.
This is good to know.
It's reassuring in these times, isn't it? No, not at all.
Yeah.
I have one.
Doesn't mean I can't be an arsehole sometimes, but hey.
Well, can't we all?
And actually, sort of also, Toby, I reckon that we should do up a range of merch with "Don't be a fucking arsehole" printed on the back.
I think that's a great idea.
Try not to.
Try.
Yeah.
So let's move on to one other.
Listen, actually, to my right stuff.
Right. So we're actually involved in a project we call Goth Lords, and can you tell us about this very exciting project? Because I'm excited about this.
Yeah. Goth Lords is fun. Goth Lords is an idea that I had back when I was 16, because I was listening to too many albums produced by people like you, Toby.
Yes.
And with people like Brian.
Right.
So I was
sort of being played on my show.
Yeah, really. I was listening to, very much metal, and very much into my nerdy history side. I did my degree in medieval history. And I had this idea of a historical fiction book, movie, TV about the fall of the Roman Empire seen through the eyes of the Goths, who were the tribe that came in and did it. And people don't know so much about them. People know Gothic, and they think Goths, people hang out in the shopping malls with with powder on their faces and so on, and pretend to be vampires. And why that motif? And why is Gothic pointy and medieval and creepy? And why is it Gothic means away from the norm? And so, and this intrigued me a bit. And it evolved into a project where I was hired actually to write it as a film script by the team who produced Lord of the Rings.
Okay.
And we did do that, but it didn't get made because I was just too unknown as a script writer.
Okay.
Despite the fact that I'd had some success with other books and so forth, and had made a documentary. So I said, well, sorry, I'm just going to go off and write them as a series of books. But the person who I had been involved with for the movies was a guy called Mark Ordesky, who was the main executive producer on The Lord of the Rings. And he and I subsequently produced a TV show together called The Quest, which is a game show where people basically play, it's real life Dungeons and Dragons. And it'll be on Disney Plus in the fall. You can look out for it. And then we thought, I had always had in my mind with the Goth Lords project that it would have a heavy metal soundtrack and a metal electronica folk soundtrack that would basically follow the story. So like similar to a prog rock album from the 70s, like concept album, but more fun and much more hard rocking and just, creatively interesting. But I'm not really a musician. I was actually a chorister at the Temple Church in London, which is one of the I'm effectively Temple where the Knights Templar were based, and it's a very prestigious but highly unpleasant organization to have been part of as a young boy. But I'll leave that to your imagination. But the don't be an arsehole. Try not to be an arsehole. But we could go many places. It's almost joke paralysis there. So many options. But the upshot was that although I'm not a musician, I can conceive of melodies, and I'm not a terrible lyric writer, and I can conceive of songwriting craft, but I never thought, and I can play like abysmally bad acoustic guitar, but I can still pick out a basic melody to put something together with. And I'd had these songs rolling around in my head for years and years and years, and thought, well, but yeah, I'm not really a musician, and so and then I ran into Brian Demar from this podcast, which is always a dangerous thing to do, clearly. And I ran into him because of autism, because I was back in 2019. I was going out to Alabama to look at a group who were doing Horseboy there, and the bloke who picked me up from the airport was this guy Brian. And I said, "Oh, what do you do?" He said, "Oh, musician." And I said, "Oh, what do you do?" I said, "Oh, I used to be in the band called Ministry." I'm like, "No shit, I kind of worshipped Ministry." He goes, "Oh, well, you know." And we just got chatting, and I told him a little bit about Goth Lords project, and he didn't have the standard rock musicians, well, fuck off, you know, answer. He said, "Well, that's interesting. Fall of the Roman Empire." Yeah, he said, "Just hum me something, you know, send me something on WhatsApp. Just hum me some ideas of the tunes you've got." And I was so shy to do this. I didn't do it, and I didn't do it, and I didn't do it, and I didn't do it. And I thought, Rupert, you're just being such a chicken, you know, just do it. The worst that he's going to do is say that sucks, and then okay, it sucks. Just don't worry about it. So I finally did, and he went, "Oh." And this is very Brian. Obviously, you know Brian very well, and Brian's sort of egoless. So he's like, "Oh, well, do you mean this?" He just sort of got back to me immediately with something on guitar. I'm like, "That's exactly what I meant.
That's awesome.
That's exactly what I meant, actually." And he went, "Oh, well, if that's exactly what you meant, how about this and this and this? And we've got this great singer over here, and da-da-da. How about some lyrics? You know, give me some lyrics." And then he sends me this stuff back, him singing with lyrics. He goes, "Oh, excuse my terrible, you know, vocals." Of course, they weren't terrible vocals. They were great vocals. And he puts this song. We basically started putting the song together. I'm like, "Oh, fuck, we could actually do this. That's interesting. I never would have thought we could do this." So Goth Lords now, and then he said, "Oh, and I know this bloke Toby Wright, who, you know, produced Metallica and Alice in Chains." And people like, "He's not going to take us seriously." He said, "No, he was. That's right. What we do, just don't worry about it. We're just gonna, you know, which is exactly, of course, what I would do professionally if it's a writing project or a horse project or something. If it's interesting, I mean, it's interesting, right? You do it. So, as you know, we are now producing some songs which follow the first book, and the first book is being written, but it's also being looked at for television. And I don't want to give too much away of the story, but it's seen through the eyes of 4 children. So the fall of Rome is seen through the eyes of 4 children. 2 are Goth, 2 are Roman. Rome is sacked by the Goths in 410 AD. It's a seminal moment. It's the end of antiquity. It's the end of the ancient world. It's the beginning of the medieval and the modern world. And these children are all special needs children. One is hermaphrodite and can't walk. One is mute and autistic. One is physically disabled, lacks a hand, and has cerebral palsy. And another one has terrible epilepsy. And they have a supernatural element to them too, which I don't want to go into too much, which they gradually discover through the course of this first book. And they realize that they are basically being harnessed to cause this apocalypse. And that this apocalypse has a reason, which is that all of these ancient cultures that started, this is back to the thing of farming, starts with farming, and then, you know, it starts in the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia and Eastern Turkey, and what's modern day, you know, Kurdistan, Iran, Iraq, and all these ancient cultures which grew really big, like Sumeria, Uruk, Acadia, Assyria, Persia, Parthia. They're all basically the same region. Judea, Canaan, you know, it's a crescent like that from the Mediterranean down to the Persian Gulf, of these Mesopotamia, the land between the 2 rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. All of them gradually more, and then Egypt, and then Greece, and then Rome, ever increasing reliance upon slavery and human atrocity to create wealth and power. And the idea is that this needs to end, and these kids are harnessed to do this. And of course, they don't want to do it at all. They're powerless. And they're like, no, absolutely not. And they're left in a position where they have no choice, and they are the agents for this. But it's heavy cross to bear, but it's also a lot of fun. And we follow in the first book how this happens, and they grow up in this process and are fused together and become these 4 children of the apocalypse. And this Goth Lords band and soundtrack, following the Goth Lords book and or movie TV thing, follows this story. So this album will be the episodes in that first book and first TV series.
That sounds great.
So it'd be
That sounds awesome. That sounds really, really interesting.
Yes.
Yeah, really,
better
really
than
good.
Game of Thrones.
God of war, God of blood, God of war, freedom, God of blood, freedom, break the chains, freedom, God of war, freedom, break the chains. There's a stirring in the east, tribe against tribe, brother against brother, and soon the tribe shall wander till the new land shall be found. On sunlight, vines, and tall oak trees, where the white horses graze by the endless sea. Bring water's blood to break the chains. Fire for the cleansing, earth to make new forests grow, and the breath of God to raise them, and the breath of God to raise them. God of blood, God of blood, God of blood, God of war, God of blood, God of war, God of blood, God of war, God of blood.
As interesting as this has been, unfortunately, time waits for no man, and we have to bring this episode to a close. And I'd love to do a part 2 anytime to, document our progress and your progress.
Now, just quickly before we go, for the podcasters, if I was giving this podcast, I would want from Gareth, Brian, and Toby now one band I should listen to this week.
Well, I've
Start
got
with
it
you,
on my
Gareth. Who should
t-shirt.
I listen
Bob
to?
Villain. They're a grime
Villain.
punk band from London, and
Okay.
they're very, very interesting. And I'm very much loving their work at the moment.
Bob Villain.
Yeah,
I'm
you
on
can
it.
see that on the screen.
Okay.
Bob Villain. Yeah.
Bob Villain. It's Bob Villain's killing
Yes.
punk rock.
Yeah.
Got it.
Bob
Bob
Villain.
Villain. I will go forthwith while I'm writing Goth Lords and listen. Brian, who should I be listening to?
Manchester Orchestra.
Okay. Tell me about them quickly.
Atlanta band, Andy Hull, it's his band. It is some of the most amazingly melodic, lush, beautiful, heavy music that you can possibly listen to. I mean, it's so melodic, yet the guy's an amazing musician, amazing songwriter. The lyrics are amazing. I mean, just all around, it's a phenomenal band. Manchester Orchestra.
Okay. So Bob Villain, Manchester Orchestra. Toby, your camera's gone, but are you still there? Can you hear?
No, there I am. Yes, I can still hear you, and I think that let's see, I'm going to pick one of Brian's favorites, Joy Division.
Ah, okay. Any particular song?
Ooh, no, I think you should start with the beginning and listen to the first record. It's one of my favorites.
Okay, perfect.
I think that'll set
And
up
I've got
the
one.
Goth Lords thing.
Okay, I've got one. It's a woman, a Danish woman. I was talking. Brian and I were listening to her a bit. Mercure.
Okay.
She goes by the name of Mercure, but her real name is Amelie Brune.
Okay.
And her Mercure stuff, she has albums that are only black metal
Okay.
and albums that are only folk.
Yeah.
And I would listen to her folk album called Folksanger in Danish. It just means folk songs.
How do you spell that?
Her name or the album?
The band name.
Mykur, Mercure.
Okay. Just writing it down.
It means darkness, yeah.
Right.
And I would actually, in that case, start with her first album with the opening track. The first album is called just M, and the opening track is something extraordinary. And you can hear Monteverdi. You can hear whispers of Claudio Monteverdi in there. Monteverdi Vespers of 1610 of the Blessed Virgin, mixed with this heaviness. It's really good. But then her Folksanger album, listen to a song called Harpans Kraft.
Okay.
Harpans Kraft. Yeah, give it a go.
Sounds sweet. Okay.
Bob Dylan, Manchester Orchestra, Joy Division, Mercure.
You got it.
We'd be good for a week of listening.
That's right.
All right.
At least.
Excellent. We certainly are.
And if people want to know more about the work we do with autism, just go to our website. New Trails Learning Systems is our thing. NTLS, November Television Logarithm Samantha. NTLS dot. Why is Samantha funny? But it is somehow, isn't it? NTLS dot co, not .com, but .co, because we couldn't afford the .com. So ntls.co, New Trails Learning Systems. It's all on there, all the brain science, everything. Check it out. You might find something useful for yourself there. Little manual to the brain.
Yes, thank you for that, because I was going to ask you, how do we get in touch with you and find out more?
Thank you very much.
So that's a perfect website.
Info at ntls.co. Book is The Horseboy and the Long Ride Home. 2 books.
Yep.
Documentary, The Horseboy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rupert Isaacson, my co-host, Gareth Dyton. That was an amazing learning experience. And I can't thank you enough. And I'd like to thank my sponsor, Tomes, a natural sleep and sound healing portal, which may help you get to sleep faster and stay asleep longer. We also have lullabies for the kiddos and a sound healing section and a high performance section that can help all you athletes and peeps who want to accelerate your learning and your depth of absorption. This piece of gold can be found on the web at www.tomes.com. That's www.taumhoms.com. Thank you both again. You're amazing. And
well, thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. And thanks for watching.
You're very most welcome.
It has been informative for you, as it has been for me and Gareth. And as they say in Wales, no star, or good night.
No star, you lovely people. Take care.
Cheers.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you for watching My Right Stuff. This episode was brought to you by Tones, a natural sleep and sound healing portal available globally at www.tomes.com. That's www.taumhoms.com.